Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Coffman Podcast. This is where academic medicine meets remote, austere, and resource-limited areas. Welcome back to the program. This is Aebhric OKelly. We are again with Sam Coffman on the third episode, a third in a series of unconventional warfare gardening, guerrilla gardening, for MSIW, Medical Support for Irregular Warfare. Sam is a former 18 Delta, and he has a master's degree in medicinal herbs and acupuncture, and has a book called one of his several books called Survival Gardening. And if you don't have it in your library, you are losing cool points. So Sam, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Aebhric. Great to be here again.
So we've talked about just a general introduction of unconventional warfare ICU, and last episode we had a wee bit of chat on the edibles, the food, and now this episode we're going to talk about plant medicine. So can you walk us through maybe a top 10 on what a remote medic or a 18 Delta or 68 whiskey or a nurse working in a clinic in the middle of Africa, what are some plants that they are going to need to supplement their herbal or their medicinal platform?
Sure. I mean, of course, you have to ask yourself what is available, first of all, for them from the standpoint of pharmaceutical medicine, and where are the gaps going to be that we need sustainability on? Is it going to be antibiotics, for instance? Are we going to have to be dealing with perhaps wound infections and biofilm inhibition and wound infection management? Is it going to be there's a prevalence of upper respiratory tract, viruses or gastrointestinal virus outbreaks that we're dealing with, and we don't have anything for that. So based on what that is, I would say is, more where are our needs for sustainability? And the good news is there are certainly plants to be able to fill in there everywhere, regardless of where you are on the planet. And again, back to what I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast here was that it's more a function of the temperate zone that you live in than where you live on the planet. So if you could just draw a horizontal belt around based on both elevation and, of course, distance from the equator is probably, and then obviously rainfall is going to give you a better idea of what's going to be available anywhere within that same similar kind of temperate zone, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in North America, whatever, or the Southern Hemisphere too. So that's kind of where we get into it, right? So then we can kind of start breaking down these herbs from a Western perspective, not so much from an Eastern, from a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, but from a Western acute care is really what we're looking at here. And that's where we start to think about what herbs are going to be antimicrobial, for instance, specifically antibacterial or biofilm inhibitors, what I call biofilm busters, are really useful for something like, where we're dealing with wound infection. Any infection that's been going on for longer than 72 hours, we're going to have a biofilm. Oftentimes, if we have just a chronic upper respiratory tract infection, maybe that's gone to bacterial, or if we had, strep throat or something of that sort, we're going to probably want something like that as well. And the good news is that we can work with these herbs across different body systems, oftentimes with the same effect. In other words, it doesn't have to be one herb that is an antibacterial for, cellulitis topically, and one herb that's going to be a different herb that's going to be for an antibacterial for something else and somewhere else in the body. It's going to be the same herb, but just how we apply it to the body, right? So within that, then, what are the parameters? What are some of the most important herbs? Well, I think, when you start looking at herbs from a standpoint of medicine, some of the underlying principles that I think you need to really take advantage of are not just the pharmaceutical idea of principles. In other words, not just herbs that are strictly going to kill a certain type of bacteria, right? Although we have those, right? And we have, for instance, berberine is famous for that. Berberine we have it in golden seal, we have it in all our Berberaceae family herbs. So that would be like our barberries, right? Like algarita and so forth. We have it in Chinese coptis. We have it in gold thread. I mentioned golden seal, I believe. And so that's this yellow alkaloid. It's very water soluble. It comes out that we can use. And that, for instance, historically got famous back in India. People started studying it because in Calcutta, I believe there was a huge cholera outbreak that killed like 1.5 million people or something over a course of several months, maybe a year. That was the heyday of this was the 60s. It was the heyday of penicillin. It wasn't obviously even touching it. And somebody started using golden seal, and it was just drying up the cholera neighborhood by neighborhood. And so they started studying it and found that hydrostein and in particular berberine were these two alkaloids and berberine in particular, that was very strongly antibacterial for the cholera in particular. And so since then, it's caught on, and now it's a supplement that you can buy, extracted by itself, and a lot of functional medicine docs and naturopaths and so forth use it as well. That's an example of a very strongly antibacterial herb. But the thing is that a plant, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, has thousands of constituents. So it's more a question, I think, of what's the general body system that we're trying to support, more than what is the bacteria that we're trying to kill or, trying to nuke from a pharmaceutical perspective. And that's really, I think, where the strength of herbs happens, even though we can do both, right? An example of an herb that has both, for instance, would be Mahonia species, Oregon grape or leatherleaf Oregon grape, or any of the Mahonia species generally. The leaf of the plant contains a compound that's called 5', it's MHC is what everybody calls it, but it's 5' methoxyhydrocarbon. And this is famously an efflux inhibitor for efflux pumping of a specific type, nor A type in particular, that you find in a lot of staph and in MRSA infections. And this efflux inhibitor inhibits the efflux pumping of these bacterial cells, so that something like berberine, that's in the root of the Mahonia species, right? Again, it's another Berberidaceae family herb, is more effective, up to 15 times more effective. That berberine is going to enter and kill the bacteria, right? So that's an example of sort of this indirect antibacterial effect. And then we have herbs that are really good at supporting the mucosa and supporting mucosal health. And as I mentioned earlier, probably the big part of that is actually our lymph and immune system being able to support both, not just our adaptive immune system, but also our innate immune system, to be able to help our body deal with that infection in the first place. So that's a really long-winded kind of almost tangent about how you would go about determining what plants. But, I have a long time ago, I created this little flyer, this little PDF, and it's a little booklet, and it's called the 25 top herbs for the end of the world. What would you do? And the way that I really came about that, it has not changed a bit since then, with all my experience in the field using nothing but herbs, is that, you kind of go through body systems if you're going to do it from an acute care Western standpoint, which is, your respiratory tract, your gut, your urinary tract, your integumentary system, your HEENT. That's, kind of, and of course with HEENT, really we're getting back into the respiratory tract and the mucosa as well. And then one more is the lymph system and the lymph and immune. And so if you kind of look at having at least a narrow range of herbs that kind of fit within each of those areas, you're going to be pretty well stocked for most things that can happen, because again, you're going to be able to overlap those herbs together, and you're going to be able to support urinary tract mucosa, while we also have herbs that are going to disengage, the adhesions of, let's say, E. coli type bacteria in the urothelium itself. And we also have herbs that are going to be very supportive of the mucosa of the urothelium at the same time, to help it heal and to help it get past that inflammatory stage. And then finally, one thing that's sort of an herbal concept, and it's very prevalent in traditional Chinese medicine, and also it should be something we recognize a lot better in Western medicine, is the idea of increasing microcirculation, not just of the lymph, but also just general vascular microcirculation, and being able to clean out garbage better, to eliminate the garbage from a wound, to eliminate the garbage from inflammation, and get rid of that so that the body area is able to recover more quickly. And that's really where herbs do an incredible job as well.
So Sam, you teach this for a living. So what's a list? Give us a top list of what you suggest someone to have for medicinal herbs.
Sure. So again, kind of going around through our systems, right? And as many herbs that'll overlap in those systems as possible. And by systems, I mean HENT, upper respiratory, gut, urinary tract, and integumentary, and lymph and immune system. I would say, one of the biggest issues that I normally get in the field that I always want to be prepped for is upper respiratory tract stuff. So what we need is any kind of mucosal vulnerary. And what that is that's an herb that has a lot of heteropolysaccharides that help support the mucosa, but also help, as I mentioned before, stimulate that submucosal lymph. Probably the most profoundly available and effective one of that is mallow. And that could be marshmallow, or that could be common mallow, even, that I mentioned before as a food. It's a little round leaf mallow that grows out of every sidewalk crack in America and probably all around the world that you find. And it's the root of that we can use as a very, very effective mucosal vulnerary. A vulnerary is an old word out of older, back from the 19th century that meant an herb that soothes, heals, and protects. So it's herbs that soothe and heal and protect the mucosa. That would be one of the herbs at the top of my list. Another one would be any berberine containing herb. And this could be Oregon grape. This could be algarita. This could be Chinese coptis. It could be golden seal, even though although golden seal is a little at risk, I don't use it. And I prefer all of the barberries like algarita, desert barberry and common barberry and so forth are all, in my opinion, a little superior to that anyway in terms of their berberine content. And that's berberine is this yellow alkaloid that we can pull out primarily with water and use it as well. So those are two big ones. Now, yarrow is a very common herb that everybody, kind of knows, and you can use the whole plant. It's very user-friendly. We can use the rhizome. We can use the leaf. We can use the flower, we can use the stem, even to some extent, we can use the seed, even the tiny little seeds. But when you harvest the flower, you get those sometimes. And this is useful for a number of reasons. One is internally as both a, kind of a cold and flu herb. It's an eliminative, it's a diaphoretic, it's an aquaretic. I hate to say diuretic because these herbs are not diuretics in the traditional pharmaceutical sense. They tend to be more herbs that increase flow and the movement of blood through the kidneys so that we get a higher amount of elimination, urinary tract elimination without draining electrolytes, right? So yarrow is very good for that. It's a profoundly well-known wound and tissue healer. And this can be for sprains and strains and closed, types of injuries all the way to even open, lacerations and burns and so forth. And in my opinion, again, what it does is it increases the circulation to that area and helps speed up the inflammation process in what I consider to be the second stage of wound healing, which is inflammation. So once we get past that, we can start into proliferation and so forth. Yarrow is really useful in that way. Absolutely. We get another one that's not as well known, but it's most of the milkweeds are very common, and in particular, we get, any of the common milkweed or the one that I used to use in Texas all the time, which is called Immortal, is a really good one as well. And we use the root of that. Pleurisy is a common one as well, but sometimes called butterfly weed. And the root of this plant is an incredibly good deep expectorant and bronchial relaxant, as well as being an antimicrobial, in my opinion, for the upper respiratory tract type stuff. So we could even nebulize it and take it as a nebulizer. You can do that, or we can take it internally, and it still helps that way. And by internally, I mean, taking the extract of it, or even the plant, the dried root itself in a tea, and so forth. It's not very good tasting, so it's generally better to extract it anyway. This is most of our species. Now they're a little more on the toxic side, so you have to be careful. How you use it. It needs to be dried first, and then you make the medicine out of it, and it needs to be formulated ideally as opposed to used by itself. But it's an incredible. I mean, that's what it's got its name from. Right? It was pleuritis, was being able to be used for deep, like lower respiratory tract infections. So that's one that I think is really useful here for us as well. You mentioned nettles and nettle for food, and that's absolutely true. The leaf itself is also a very strong anti-inflammatory from kind of a Western perspective, but also the seed and the root is very useful for kidney and urinary tract support. This is true of the root, especially for things like prostatitis, for urinary tract infections, especially chronic ones. Very useful. Again, it's another really strong aquaretic, so it helps the flow, which we need in any kind of a urinary tract infection, whether upper or lower. Oftentimes, there's some science out there that points to it increasing the glomerular filtration rate. The root does. So we get a good kidney and kind of urinary tract support. And like I said, for males, for prostate support as well, for prostatitis and BPH and so forth that we're going to get from the root as well. So a very useful one there. As we move kind of through the spectrum again of systems, any berberine containing herb is going to be very useful for our gut, as well as sometimes those mucosal vulneraries are going to be useful for things like, a stomach ulcer or something of that sort, or even GERD to kind of help calm that down. But then we get into plants that are going to be helpful for our liver in general and being able to help our liver processing, power. And of course, the liver, is shown to have something, over 450 different functions. But anything that can help our liver function in general, and one of the strongest for that is very well known as milk thistle seed. So I like to consider that to be a part of a good materia medica as well for anything pretty much digestive related, liver related, where we're going to have liver congestion. Now, liver congestion is something that's not really thought of too much in Western medicine, but it's absolutely a thing. I mean, where you usually find it is when we get portal vein hypertension and even esophagitis and so forth that can come from esophageal varices that can stem out from that. But in general, you just think about somebody who's gone through a lifetime of not really taking good care of what they eat, or maybe they drink a lot, or just time over time, the liver just starts to get, it's just not as efficient. So our bile is not as good. We don't make as much of it, which of course consequently affects our digestion of proteins and fats at that portion of our small intestine, right past the stomach. So all of that kind of comes into play. So it's really important, I think, to be able to have good liver support, and that's a really good one. More commonly, you're going to see are going to be most of your thistles and your thistle roots. I mean, thistle literally grows everywhere around the world, and most of your thistle roots are going to be strong, what I call liver decongestants as well. Blessed thistle or Cnicus benedictus is probably one of the most famous of those, but literally any thistle will generally give you some degree of that effect as well. So it's good to just, kind of know that about your thistles. One that I love that also grows around the world is going to be echinacea. And it's, of course, very well known. The root is used a little differently from the flower, but it is, again, one of those that contains all these polysaccharides in the flower that are extremely, produce a high amount of macrophage and neutrophil volume and activity. So it's great for general infections. It's great for the mucosa. And then the root is full of these alkylamides that they literally make your tongue buzz. We have a triple carbon bond with those, and they're very good for a number of things. Number one is, I think, strengthening the immune system, but a whole nother piece of this is something to deal with venom, in particular snake venom, but also most venom that has, for instance, hyaluronidase in it, which is an enzyme that breaks down our hyaluronic acid in our body to be able to allow venom to travel across compartments, for instance, rattlesnake venom. And so we get, and I've had experience in the field with dogs with rattlesnake bites and with humans with copperhead bites using the root of echinacea, in particular the angustifolia species. And the results are incredible, phenomenal, unbelievable how fast it can inhibit the movement of that toxin across compartments in the body. So that's one. There are others who do this. Turmeric is another one. And this is a kitchen herb too. Turmeric does that as well as a hyaluronidase inhibitor, but it's also a very strong anti-inflammatory. And in many ways, another one of those liver, what I talked about, the liver support and liver decongestion herbs, while at the same time also, in my opinion, increasing vascularity or microcirculation to areas that are injured. So I think, again, when we're talking about anti-inflammation, we're not talking about a pharmaceutical type of where we're cutting off pathways or stopping things, but rather where we're increasing, if anything, we could call it pro-inflammatory, sort of in the way that maybe that platelet-rich plasma, like PRP treatment, is sort of pro-inflammatory and speeds up that cycle of getting through the inflammatory stage for people with like long-standing tendinosis and so forth, where they never get really past that inflammatory cycle. And I think that's what turmeric probably does as well. It's my own estimation, and yarrow as well, similar, of what those do. So those are that kind of a few herbs in each of those little areas. And as I mentioned, I've got that top herbs for the end of the world, 25 herbs that you can have as a download too if you want, and that kind of gets into more detail on that too.
Nice. We'll definitely have a link so you can download your 25 herbs for the end of the world. And you mentioned yarrow, and I loved what I learned at the Wilderness Awareness School was the legend of Achilles. So the whole thing about Achilles is he was immune to any type of wounding. The legend is that his mam held him by his heel and dipped him in the river Styx, which is absolute bollocks. What actually happened, you can read in the Iliad, is yarrow. So yarrow was mentioned in the Iliad as a styptic, as a wound healing. So what happened back then? Combat was quote unquote civilized. So at the end of the day, they shook hands or whatnot and just went to their camps and ate. But what Achilles and his men was doing, what they were doing was getting yarrow and putting him in all the wounds. So the next day they would wake up, they would go back into the lines and line up, and all these men from Achilles and himself was not dead from the wound. And that's where the legend come from. You couldn't kill Achilles. Well, he used yarrow.
Right. Yeah, and it is an amazing tissue healer. There's also, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard the stories that a lot of Native American tribes would make sure, this goes back to kind of guerrilla gardening and fighting, they would make sure they knew exactly where the patches of yarrow were, and if they were doing an ambush or whatever, they knew they were going to have a battle, having easy access back to fields of yarrow.
Awesome. So Sam, you mentioned turmeric, and one thing that I like to think about, since I'm a knuckle dragger, I'm not an herbalist like yourself with advanced degrees in this. So the guy in the ground needs to have options available. And any kitchen, you're going to find herbs that we use for food. And can we have a short chat on what some of these very common herbs, food, what common food is available to us that we can use for medicines? So you mentioned
Yeah,
turmeric.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so turmeric, I think absolutely needs to be in that list, maybe near the top. Cayenne also should probably be near the top of that.
so what does cayenne do for you?
There's a really interesting herb. So there's some research that I've read that I thought was really interesting about it, increasing coronary circulation. And I have not had this experience, but I know herbalists who have stated that they have, at least, so maybe hearsay, of working with cayenne for immediate resolution of chest pains, of angina, and being able to, just basically you mixing about an eighth of a teaspoon into a little bit of water, maybe, 50 mils of water or so, and then drinking it down, letting it sit kind of even sublingually and swallowing it and getting this immediate effect of increased coronary circulation. Perhaps that's how it would, that's certainly the theory. And there is research, as I said, that shows that that is true. But you could probably use it topically in that regard too. I use cayenne for a number of things. I use it also for my own coronary health or my own heart health. I like it. I take a little bit every day along with my chai. And it's one of those herbs, again, that increases vascularity. And I think that's really an important concept. Now, a lot of people talk about it as a styptic, and it is. It's a very good styptic. It's any herb that is astringent, like yarrow, for instance, that we just talked about, is going to be styptic, and especially if it's ground into a powder, it's going to be a wound stopper, a blood stopper. Of course, it's going to sting in the case of cayenne as well, but it's very useful for, ironically, even though it's a styptic, it's very useful for increasing that microcirculation as well. And this goes back to the same thing to yarrow. People say, well, it's a styptic, but how is it then that it seems to increase healing? And that's my point, is I don't think that the styptic portion of it is really what, that may be a short-term piece that you're going to get off of any astringent, again, especially as a powder in a wound area. But the most important piece is that it's going to increase microcirculation and speed up that inflammatory process to get through that inflammation and into the proliferation that we need to be able to heal that wound. So I think cayenne is right up there near the top, along with yarrow in that regard too.
There's good research as a vasodilator. So the capsicum, is that what is capsicum, has some great research on PubMed. You can go to PubMed, type in capsicum, and there's tons of research on vasodilator.
Yeah, right. Another good vasodilator that's a heating herb is, or the constituent. So like capsaicin is with capsicum, and piperine is for black pepper. And I have used, actually, I did a bunch of research. I mentioned going down to Nicaragua several times, and one time working with the Rama tribe in their village, which was, again, like 100 miles from the nearest road. You could only get there by boat. And one of the biggest issues that they had was leishmaniasis there, not visceral.
Cutaneous.
Yeah, cutaneous leishmaniasis. And all along that river is just like black flies everywhere that spread it. And everybody has scars on their legs from it, right? And I did a bunch of research before going down, and one of the biggest herbs that I'd found had been used experimentally to be able to slow and or even kill leishmaniasis was piperine in black pepper. So I made a bunch of formulas with that, and not just black pepper. I had a number of other herbs in it as well, but that was an important herb that was in every single formula. And I worked with several people, and one was a young lady, probably she was only about 12 years old or so, who had just had a brand new, scar form on her leg, or the sore, the actual sore. And normally they would carry those sores around for about a year and a half, and then they would turn into a scar. And so everybody had these round scars on their legs. And the woman that introduced us to the tribe had married into the tribe. She was actually an American, and she spoke fluent, Rama, and was married to a man who was part of their council. And so every 3 months or so, she would go down to town and she would be able to email me. And so she emailed me pics, of these people that I'd worked with these herbs for leishmaniasis. And she's like, we're amazed. Like, they've never seen this happen. The scar is already, the sore is gone. And she's sending me pictures of this young lady, and there's almost no scar there at all. I just started, that's where piperine really started to be something I was looking at. And it popped up again and again in other, again, PubMed research on different aspects of it as an antimicrobial and anti-parasitic for single cell, parasites, for protozoans. And I think it's a really important herb, again, as just a microcirculatory enhancer, even for wounds and wound healing too.
Nice. And there's a lot of research on garlic and ginger as well. Can we do a little deep dive into each one of those?
Absolutely. Ginger, and these are both, again, heating herbs. So when we say heating herbs, these are going to increase microcirculation. Now, garlic, we were talking in the previous podcast about cellulitis. There's this concept of using what's called garlic socks that I read about 30 years ago. And I was like, what? And, basically crushing up garlic, putting it in a sock and putting it on your foot like overnight and to be able to get the garlic into your bloodstream. And I thought, well, that can't be true. And so I tried it once just from, at the very beginning when I first read about it. And the next morning I wake up and I've got garlic breath, right? It's like clearly the garlic or that, those sulfur compounds, the lanthone made it into my bloodstream because now I'm excreting it through my respiratory tract. And that's what garlic breath is. It's not from your gut. It's excreting those sulfur compounds through your respiratory tract. And so I was like, okay, there's obviously something to this. So then I started messing around with it because it's such a heating herb and it increases the microcirculation at the surface of the skin on the foot. And you have to put it in a little bit of oil too. You want to, and don't put it on the top of your foot because it'll burn. It'll cause a little bit of a chemical burn on your foot, a minor one if you're not careful. But mixing that with other herbs, and I started using that. And years later, the first time I used it was for a person with really, really late stage type 2 diabetes who had fungal infections on his toenail fungal infections and had cellulitis in his, like just above the ankle. And I was like, there's no way we weren't able to get to it any other way. I thought, let's try the garlic sock thing. And sure enough, the garlic sock 2 nights in a row and the cellulitis started going down. That red waxy, sheen started to dissipate. So garlic is an amazing, it's an antimicrobial, certainly an antibacterial in its own right, and even a biofilm buster to some extent, inhibiting some of the different biofilms. But I think it's got so many other, it's not incredibly strong per se, but it's broader in terms of its use than it is deep, I would say, in many ways. We can use it even for help with digestive, issues that are related to gastrointestinal bacterial gastroenteritis. It is, as I mentioned, surface really good. But the fact that it actually is excreted, that those sulfur compounds come out through your lungs, through your respiratory tract, gives it definitely some validity as well as an upper respiratory herb also. And again, back around to this idea of these heating herbs that increase microcirculation being really important in the sense of healing and getting rid of trash. And ginger is very much the same way. Again, people talk about ginger as an anti-inflammatory. Yeah, it's got some, when they say that, they'll find a single constituent and say that it turns off or inhibits a certain inflammatory pathway. But again, what it really does, it's a microcirculatory enhancer. So I think it really speeds up inflammation more than anything. Ginger is useful from a TCM perspective and used a lot in TCM medicine to be able to heat what they would call the middle jiao, especially. In other words, any kind of digestive situations where we would have an excess of cold or damp, where we need to be able to heat and to speed things up. And that's going down another, a tangent here that we probably don't want to get into, but know that it is used traditionally throughout the world as a medicine and has been for, probably millennia.
And that's something you can resupply very easily in a Guerrilla ICU. Like you can send one of your locals down to the grocery store and pick up ginger, pick up garlic, pick up turmeric.
Absolutely. And you can grow them yourself. You can put them in sand and some moisture and you can grow them yourself too.
How long does it take? So if you cut off a bit of ginger or garlic, or clove of garlic, you put it in some good ground. How long until I can harvest that?
Well, a couple of months.
All right. Something to plan for. Definitely.
Right.
So as someone who teaches a lot of improvised medicine, when it comes to honey, there's a ton of things we can do. So give us a little deep dive into why honey should be in your medical kit.
Absolutely. I think one thing to note is that honey is also a really good solvent. So we can infuse honey with herbs that we want. I have an entire line. I don't know if you know about our store, but it's called herbalfirstaidgear.com. And it's based off of our apothecary. Used to be specifically for healthcare practitioners, functional medicine docs, and NPs who needed my product. And now it's public facing. But one of the lines of products we do is called the apothecary's bag, or the backpacker's apothecary. And one of the big things in that is our honeys, our different honeys. And the idea is, even though honey is kind of heavy, compared to say water, it's a little heavier, but, a small, like 4-ounce little, envelope type, plastic envelope type with a spout is how we normally have it. And you can use it to sweeten, but it's also infused herbally. So let's say you wake up and you're in the middle of the woods on a backpacking trip and you're starting to feel like you have a little bit of a sinus infection or upper respiratory tract infection or whatever, just not feeling right, you can take a little bit of the honey and add it in as a sweetener to your tea that you're already making or whatever you want, or just take a dab, under your tongue, and you're going to have this infused honey because it's such a great solvent as well by itself. Secondly, though, and what it's better known for, kind of to the public, is the idea of it being a antibacterial wound healer. And so we have a huge industry off of that with Manuka honey, for instance, and, its levels of antibacterial and so forth. That's true, but I think that you're going to get some degree of that no matter what with any good honey. It doesn't have to be Manuka honey. You don't have to pay, $1,000 for a pound of it. It's something that you can absolutely get it as an affordable, with any decent honey from an apiary or in your own neighborhood. If you have the fortune to have that, or if you grow your own, it is, a humectant. It holds fluid in, and it's great for wound healing and to apply to burns and wounds. The only downside to it is that because of its humectant properties, it can cause a wound to become too macerated, too wet. So you really have to kind of keep that balance between wet and dry all the time, with your wounds. And wound healing and honey is one of those that if your wound's starting to dry out, it's perfect to put in there. If it's starting to get too wet, you got to clean it out or take it out. It also, just from the standpoint, just like sugar, you're going to get two properties from it. So like there's the old adage that you could put sugar into an infected wound, right? And it's basically because of its hypotonic quality. It's going to kill all the bacteria, and of course, it's going to kill some of the healthy cells too in that area as it just implodes them, right? And then you clean it out. Otherwise, you're going to have bacteria food for the next, generation that starts growing in there. But that idea, and with honey, I think you get that to some degree too. But honey is by nature anti-infective, and it metabolizes into the wound. I've found, especially burns, really well, and you don't have to worry about cleaning it out unless the wound starts to just become way too macerated.
So honey should definitely be in your medical kit. And I mean, white sugar, it'd be great as well, but we're just talking about, well, honey's not a plant either, is it? So fair enough. But yeah, great for wounds and great for burns.
It is. And another product you get out of the bees there, well, two products. One is beeswax, which is great for a hardener for your salves, for your oils, but also propolis. You have to be a little more careful about where you get it from, because the bees will it's sort of their antiviral, like their little patching glue that they use around the nest, around the hive. They'll get it from this tarry substance. And sometimes like they'll get it, like if there's a bunch of highway working, they'll find asphalt, for instance, in propolis. So you have to be careful where you get it from. But the propolis is very strongly antiviral, and it's like an organic glue. I will use propolis mixed with like ground up licorice root. Is incredible for aphthous ulcers in the mouth. I mean, it like dries them up in a matter of hours. You'll see somebody who's been having a canker sore for days. It's like, an hour later it's gone. So, and it's kind of like this great organic antiviral glue that you can use even as a spray to hold things together and hold them onto the mucosa as well. Like for the back of the throat, for instance, if you're trying to get some herbs back there and you gargle with them and then you spray some propolis on, it's oftentimes what I'll do as well.
Nice. So we've covered turmeric, ginger, garlic, honey, pepper as far as kitchen medicine. And what other things could I get in aisle 7 in my local supermarket that would help me in a guerrilla clinic?
Well, that's a good question. And the reason is there are a lot of herbs, right? Thyme, for instance, is a great herb for upper respiratory tract stuff. And in fact, there's some interesting research that shows that it helps support cilial cells. So when you get, for instance, something like whooping cough, where those cilial cells are being attacked by the pathogen itself and are either deadened or they can't do their function. So this is why we end up with, the mucus and all the phlegm and all the stuff getting deep into the respiratory tract until the coughing reflex is literally, enough to make a person vomit. So thyme is wonderful for that. And I found it as a very useful herb for COVID and the first strain of COVID anyway. But here's the question is, how effective is the thyme, for instance, or any herb that you're going to get from the supermarket? I think cayenne, I think turmeric you can get fresh. Cayenne, I think holds its efficacy much longer, even if it's just in a little shaker bottle or whatever that you get from the store. I think you're still going to get the efficacy from that. But a lot of the leafy herbs, I think especially those that have a lot of essential oils and aromatic oils, if they haven't been packaged right and they've been sitting in a warehouse somewhere for 3 or 4 months in the summer heat and so forth, you're going to lose a lot of the efficacy from them as well, unfortunately. So that leaves out some of these really aromatic type herbs like mints and thymes and so forth. Even though they're very medicinal, getting them from aisle 13 in the store, with your I'm trying to remember like some of the brand names of the common brand names of these, or spices you get, and they're still going to have the taste to some extent, but are they as effective really as you would get if you bought, for instance, the bulk herb or you grew it in your garden and dried it correctly and then, put it in a mason jar and sealed from oxygen? And the answer is probably not, right? But nonetheless, it's good to know what could we possibly use. And I would say, I've just mentioned it 3 times here, but thyme is absolutely one that should be up there high on that list as well for upper respiratory type stuff.
That's interesting you said about freshness, because there's peppermint tea and chamomile tea. And as an Irishman, we have tea for everything. And we've always thought that, go on, just have a peppermint cup of tea and you put 3 or 4 bags into it. So it's medicinal. Or if you want to go to sleep at night, you can get your chamomile tea, put 4 or 5 bags of chamomile and you go to sleep. Is that not true? Because it's been in a storage facility for a year.
Maybe not. Yeah, it depends again on how aromatic it is and how it's been stored. And, usually your teas that are in tea bags are going to be fresher. I mean, that's how they make their money, of course, is to have a quality, fresh type of tea. And like, for instance, I remember going on 30 years ago or more, going on a tour of Celestial Seasoning in Boulder, Colorado. And they had their mint room, and their mint room was like, a ceiling was like 30 feet high, and it's like big, almost like a steel door that, it took like a couple of people almost to push. It was so heavy. And you go in and there's these bags of mint. Everything's bagged up, but it's literally your eyes just start watering and you start, it's just like you get this immediate effect of all the all those essential oils in the air that you're breathing in of the mint. And that's how they keep it. And then they bag it from there and they get into the store. And of course, it has even a used by, best if used by date on it too. So, it kind of depends on, the source and so forth. But in general, yeah, I mean, your concept, I think, is correct that if you don't have it fresh, can you use more of it and get the same effect? And I think in general, yeah, it's sort of like charcoal. Activated charcoal, is about 3 times more adsorbent because it's been cleaned completely. But can you take charcoal that you made that you didn't activate, using one of the many methods you can do to activate it, and in other words, clean it? And the answer is yes, but you're going to need to use about 3 times as much. In other words, you're going to have to change it out in the wound probably 3 times as often to get the same effect.
So we've got a list now, a grocery list. We talked about turmeric, ginger, garlic, honey, thyme, and of course peppermint and green teas, maybe chamomile, and chili peppers. So anything else in aisle 7 of the grocery store that we might need to supplement our Guerrilla ICU?
Yes, I'm sure there are. Right now, I didn't think about this too much before we started talking, so nothing's popping into my head.
Yeah, me neither. I was thinking like aloe vera, but that's not really, I mean, you need to cut the leaf of the plant and it's just, yeah. So that's a good list, isn't it, for kitchen medicine?
It is, yeah. I guess, if you were going to go to, Mexico, if you're in Mexico, a grocery store, then you've got nopal, a prickly pear cactus, which they grind up in the nopal, which is really good too for a number of medicinal uses, to include wound cleaning and healing too. Similarly, possibly even to charcoal in some ways. That's a whole nother conversation. I could talk all about nopal, but yeah, in general, I have an apothecary of about 400 herbs. Those are, it's apothecary, and so I don't really think as much about, the kitchen grocery store aisle, even though some of those herbs are definitely in my apothecary too.
So Sam, in the last 3 episodes, we've done a deep dive into a guerrilla hospital and guerrilla gardening, and now we did guerrilla grocery, I guess we can call it. And you're putting together a talk for SOMA, for Special Operations Medical Association, and you're going to join me in the improvised medicine workshop. You're going to have a station on improvised medicine and how you can use plants to supplement that. Do you want to talk about what you're going to be doing at SOMA?
Sure, yeah. So I would like to demonstrate wound poulticing, in particular for infections, infection management, and also for wound healing. I'd like to also talk a little bit and show how to use activated charcoal in the same manner and some of the benefits that we can get from that in a workshop environment. As to the lecture, I've got about 2 or 3 different ideas, and I still need to kind of boil them down and submit for it. But definitely on the demonstration plan to be able to see how to use many of the things that we've already talked about, which are the herbs themselves. How do we make a poultice out of them? How would we use them with honey? How would we use them with water? How would we use them even in what was called an alcohol poultice, if it were a tincture? How can we use activated charcoal in the same manner? And how would we deal with something like a cellulitis or lymphangitis or just any kind of an infected wound, purulent, and maybe it's been going on for long enough we know there's a biofilm present, or even MRSA, a MRSA type of situation in the field. And I've had a lot of experience with that, even being in the middle of a MRSA outbreak once at Standing Rock of all places where it was spreading like crazy. And we can definitely do it successfully, but it takes, it's more work than just popping a pharmaceutical. You have to actually, it's going to take a little bit of work, and I'd like to demonstrate all that.
Well, if anyone wants more information about this, you can come to SOMA, to our workshop, and to the lecture that Sam's submitting, or you can buy his book called Survival Gardening by Sam Coffman and take some of his online courses, or go to Taos, New Mexico, and see a bit of a beautiful part of the world and learn more of what, Sam, you're teaching.
Yes. Thank you, Aebhric. It's herbalmedics.academy if you're looking for that. If you're looking for our products, it's herbalfirstaidgear.com. We'd love to see we love to have former military, active military. They make the best students. I love it, especially when they're special ops. So look forward to having any new students off this as well.
This has been a presentation from the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine. If you would like to earn CPD credits for this podcast, you can join the Council of Members. Being a member of the college gives you free CPD credit, free access to our virtual field guide, and discounts on our e-learning courses. You can join the team on our college website at quorum.edu.mt.